Open any standard history textbook, and you will see a very comforting, very predictable story. It tells us that human progress is a straight, upward line. We are taught that we started in caves with wooden clubs, slowly figured out how to farm, eventually built the steam engine, and then flew to the moon. It is a neat, easy-to-digest timeline. But what if that straight line is actually an illusion? What if human history isn't a steady climb, but a cycle of rising and falling, where peaks of unimaginable technological brilliance were reached, only to be wiped clean by time and global catastrophes? Today, we are going to look at the gaps, the glitches, and the physical anomalies left behind in the dirt that simply do not fit the official story. We are embarking on a massive global journey to explore the forbidden history of our planet. We will examine gigantic stone blocks in South America, sliced with the precision of modern manufacturing, decode ancient blueprints from India that describe flying machines and devastating energy weapons, and unroll impossible maps that charted Antarctica thousands of years before we supposedly had the technology to see beneath the ice. We won't be using complex academic jargon. Instead, we will look at these ancient mysteries through the lens of basic, everyday science to see just how advanced our ancestors truly were. The visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. So whether you are driving, working, or just relaxing, you can easily take this journey with me. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. I always love seeing how far across the globe these stories travel. Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button to help share this journey with others, and get comfortable. It is time to rethink everything we thought we knew about the past. When we think about ancient construction, our minds usually go straight to the Great Pyramid of Egypt or the Colosseum in Rome. We imagine thousands of workers sweating under a hot sun, pulling ropes and hauling blocks. It is a very industrial, sweat and muscle picture of the past. But when you step outside the traditional spotlight and look at specific, highly anomalous sites, that picture completely shatters. The sheer scale and precision of certain ancient stonework cannot be explained by sheer human willpower or basic copper tools. To understand why, we do not need a degree in archaeology. We just need to look at basic, everyday physics. Let us start our journey in the Middle East, in the modern-day country of Lebanon, at a site called Baalbek. If you visit Baalbek today, you will see the magnificent ruins of the Roman Temple of Jupiter. The Romans were incredible engineers, and their temple is beautiful. But the real mystery is not what the Romans built. It is what they built their temple on top of. The foundation of Baalbek is made of stone blocks so massive that they defy logical explanation. In the retaining wall of this foundation, there are 3 massive blocks known as the trilithon. Each of these neatly cut, perfectly rectangular limestone blocks weighs an estimated 800 tons. To put that into perspective, 800 tons is roughly the weight of 2 fully loaded Boeing 747 airplanes, or about 450 average-sized cars. And these stones were not just cut. They were lifted and placed more than 20 feet above the ground, fitted together so tightly that you cannot even slide a piece of paper between the joints. But the trilithon is just the beginning. A short distance away, sitting in an ancient limestone quarry, are even larger blocks that were cut but never moved to the main site. The most famous is called the Stone of the Pregnant Woman, weighing in at over 1,000 tons. An even larger block discovered nearby, often called the Forgotten Stone, weighs a staggering 1,650 tons. Mainstream history tells us that ancient people moved these blocks using wooden rollers, thick ropes, and the brute force of tens of thousands of slaves. Let us test that theory using simple, everyday mechanics. Think about a heavy piece of furniture, like a solid oak dining table. You can put it on small wheels or sliders to push it across the living room. Now, imagine taking the weight of 3 jumbo jets and placing it on a series of wooden logs. Wood has a physical limit called a crush point. Under the immense concentrated gravity of a 1,000-ton solid rock, ordinary wooden logs would not act like wheels. They would be instantly crushed into sawdust and splinters. Even if we pretend they found a magical, indestructible type of wood, we still have the problem of pulling it. Ropes made of hemp or papyrus have a breaking strain, a point where the tension becomes too much and the fibers snap. To generate enough pulling force to move 1,000 tons of dead weight, you would need hundreds of incredibly thick ropes. Physically, there is not enough surface area on the front of the stone to tie that many ropes. Furthermore, if you needed 40,000 men to pull those ropes, they would stretch out for miles. How do you coordinate 40,000 people to pull at the exact same millisecond to overcome the initial static friction? If they do not pull simultaneously, the ropes snap one by one. Today, to lift a 1,000-ton weight, we use massive, specialized hydraulic crawler cranes made of high-tensile steel, running on diesel fuel, driven by computerized balance systems. The idea that people wearing sandals achieved this with ropes and sticks is not just unlikely. According to the laws of physics, it is mechanically impossible. If Baalbek shows us an impossible mastery of weight, our next stop shows us an impossible mastery of precision. We are leaving the Middle East and traveling across the world to the Andes Mountains in South America. High up on a barren plateau in Bolivia, more than 12,000 feet above sea level, lies the ruined complex of Puma Punku. The first thing you notice about Puma Punku is the environment. The air is incredibly thin here. If you have ever hiked at a high altitude, you know that just walking fast can leave you gasping for breath. The idea of doing grueling, heavy manual labor in this oxygen-deprived environment is daunting. Moreover, this site is above the tree line. No trees grow here. So the standard historical explanation of "they rolled the stones on wooden logs" is immediately thrown out the window. They had no logs. But the real mind-bending mystery of Puma Punku is not how they moved the stones, but how they cut them. The ruins look like the aftermath of a massive explosion that scattered the pieces of a giant, ancient Lego set. The stones here are primarily made of red sandstone and a volcanic rock called andesite. To understand the problem, we need to talk about hardness. In science, there is something called the Mohs scale, which measures how hard a material is from 1 to 10. Talc, like baby powder, is a 1. A diamond, the hardest natural substance, is a 10. The mainstream narrative states that the indigenous people of this era only possessed primitive tools made of stone or soft metals like copper. Copper sits at about a 3 on the Mohs scale. Andesite, the rock at Puma Punku, sits at about an 8. It is incredibly dense and hard. Trying to carve an intricately detailed, perfectly smooth geometric shape into andesite using a copper chisel is exactly like trying to cut through a thick steel vault door using a plastic butter knife. It is a physical impossibility. The softer tool will simply bend, dull, and destroy itself against the harder material without making a scratch. Yet the stones at Puma Punku are not just scratched or chipped. They are engineered with a level of precision that makes modern machinists shake their heads in disbelief. We see giant blocks featuring completely flat surfaces, as smooth as a piece of glass. We see perfectly straight, completely parallel grooves cut deep into the rock. The most famous features are the H blocks. These are massive blocks of stone carved into perfect H shapes that were designed to interlock with one another, exactly like modern prefabricated building materials. Inside these blocks, there are perfect 90-degree internal right angles. If you take a standard drill or a saw and cut into a corner, you will always leave a slightly rounded edge because rotary tools are circular. To get a perfectly sharp, crisp, 90-degree inner corner inside a block of solid diamond-hard stone, you cannot just chip away at it. Today, to achieve that exact result, a modern manufacturing plant would have to use a CNC, computer numerical control, machine equipped with diamond-tipped router bits, or a highly pressurized water jet cutter mixed with garnet sand. Furthermore, we see perfectly drilled holes entering the stone at specific angles. Some of these holes are what engineers call blind holes, meaning they do not go all the way through the rock. They stop at a specific depth, and the bottom of the hole is perfectly flat. If you use a primitive hand drill, the bottom of the hole will be rounded or cone-shaped. A perfectly flat-bottomed hole implies the use of a sophisticated drill bit that does not taper, rotating at an incredibly high speed to grind away the hard rock seamlessly. There are also narrow, continuous channels cut through the stone that look exactly like conduits meant to house wiring or metal piping. And remember, all of this was done without the aid of computers, blueprints, or modern measuring tools, at least none that survived. The builders of Puma Punku were not just making artistic statues. They were manufacturing modular components. They were mass-producing interlocking pieces that fit together so tightly, without the use of any mortar or cement, that they could withstand the severe earthquakes common in the Andes. When you stand in front of the massive foundation blocks of Baalbek, or run your fingers along the glass-smooth, laser-straight edges of the H-blocks at Puma Punku, a very uncomfortable realization sets in. The official story simply does not fit the physical evidence. The people who created these sites were not primitive hunter-gatherers who got lucky with some copper chisels and hemp ropes. They possessed an understanding of mechanics, weight distribution, and high-level machining that rivals, and in some ways surpasses, our own capabilities today. They had access to lost technologies, methods of cutting, lifting, and building that have been completely erased from our history books. And as we will soon see, the mastery of megalithic stone was just the foundation. If they could manipulate 1,000-ton rocks like children's building blocks, what else could they do? Our journey is just beginning. Leaving the barren, high-altitude plateau of Puma Punku, we do not have to travel far to find our next impossible puzzle. We just need to head slightly north, deep into the heart of the Peruvian Andes, to the ancient Incan capital of Cusco. Just outside this city, sitting at an elevation of over 12,000 feet, is the fortress complex of Sacsayhuaman. When you first look at the main walls of Sacsayhuaman, it doesn't look like a traditional building. It looks like the teeth of a giant earth-eating machine. The walls are constructed in a zigzag pattern, stretching for hundreds of feet. But the true anomaly is not the layout. It is the breathtaking, logic-defying method used to fit the stones together. Mainstream history attributes this massive complex to the Inca Empire, built around the 15th century. But when the Spanish conquistadors arrived and asked the local Incas how they built these massive walls, the historical records show that the Incas themselves claimed they did not build it. They said the walls were already there, constructed by an ancient race of giants or gods, and the Incas simply built their much smaller, less sophisticated temples on top of the existing ruins. When you look at the engineering, you begin to understand why. The construction technique used at Sacsayhuaman is called polygonal masonry. Instead of cutting stones into uniform, identical rectangles like modern bricks, the builders used completely irregular shapes. Some stones have 4 sides, some have 7, and some have up to 12 different, wildly angled sides. And yet, these massive, irregular puzzle pieces, the largest of which weighs an estimated 100 to 120 tons, are fitted together so tightly that you cannot slide a razor blade or a single piece of paper between the joints. Let us break down the physical reality of what it takes to achieve this without modern machinery. Imagine playing a game of Tetris, but every block is a random, curved, 3-dimensional shape, and every block weighs as much as a fully loaded semi-truck. In modern construction, if you want 2 uneven surfaces to lock together, you use mortar or cement. Mortar acts as a cushion. It fills in the gaps, hardens, and glues the structure together. It hides your mistakes. At Sacsayhuaman, there is absolutely 0 mortar. It is a dry-fit joint. The stones rely entirely on gravity, friction, and impossibly perfect carving to stay together. To do this today, a stonemason would use a technique called scribing. You take the heavy top stone and suspend it perfectly still over the bottom stone. Then, you use a tool to trace the exact microscopic contours of the bottom stone onto the top stone. Next, you pull the top stone away, carve out the traced material, and lower it back down to check the fit. If it is off by a fraction of an inch, you lift it back up and carve again. Now, scale that up to a 100-ton boulder. Suspending 100 tons of solid rock completely still in mid-air is a nightmare even for modern heavy-duty hydraulic cranes. A slight gust of wind would turn the suspended rock into a deadly pendulum, crushing anyone working underneath it. Yet, the builders of Sacsayhuaman supposedly did this repeatedly, carving complex 3D concave and convex angles with primitive bronze chisels and stone hammers, lifting and lowering the stones perfectly until they achieved a microscopic, airtight fit. To say this is highly improbable is an understatement. It suggests they had a way of cutting, or perhaps even softening the stone on site, molding it like clay before it hardened. A lost geological technology that we cannot replicate today. But why go through all this trouble? Why not just use uniform bricks? The answer reveals a profound understanding of geology and kinetic physics. The Andes Mountains are part of the Pacific Ring of Fire. This region experiences frequent, devastating earthquakes. If you build a rigid wall out of standard uniform bricks glued together with stiff mortar, an earthquake will introduce lateral kinetic energy. The rigid wall cannot flex. so the mortar cracks, the bricks shatter, and the wall collapses. Sacsayhuaman is an engineering marvel designed specifically to survive the apocalypse. By using irregular, interlocking puzzle pieces and leaning the walls slightly inward at an angle, the builders created a dynamic, flexible structure. When a massive earthquake hits Cusco, the stones of Sacsayhuaman do not shatter. They literally dance. The lack of mortar allows the stones to vibrate, shift, and ride out the seismic waves. The immense friction between the microscopic joints absorbs and dissipates the Earth's kinetic energy. Once the shaking stops, the perfectly angled shapes and gravity pull every single stone right back into its original, perfectly locked position. It is an immortal shock absorber. It has survived thousands of years of massive earthquakes that have repeatedly leveled modern colonial buildings nearby. Leaving the high altitudes of the Andes, let us travel thousands of miles west, straight into the middle of the vast Pacific Ocean, to a place where heavy stone construction makes even less sense. We are going to the remote island of Pohnpei in Micronesia to explore the ruined, floating city of Nan Madol. If Sacsayhuaman is a fortress built to survive the shaking earth, Nan Madol is a city built to conquer the unpredictable ocean. Often called the Venice of the Pacific, Nan Madol is not built on a solid landmass. It is a series of 92 artificial islands constructed directly on top of a shallow coral reef. But it is the building material that makes this site one of the most baffling engineering anomalies on the planet. The entire city is constructed out of massive, naturally forming hexagonal and octagonal logs of black basalt rock. Basalt is a highly dense volcanic rock. When certain types of lava cool rapidly, they fracture into long, geometric columns. The builders of Nan Madol harvested these massive stone logs, some weighing up to 50 tons and measuring 20 feet long, and stacked them in a crisscross pattern, like a giant, heavy log cabin, to build retaining walls that rise 50 feet out of the ocean. Inside these walls, they dumped crushed coral to create dry land. To understand the sheer magnitude of this project, consider the math. Archaeologists estimate that over 250 million tons of basalt were moved and stacked to create Nan Madol. The effort and raw tonnage are comparable to, if not greater than, the Great Pyramid of Giza. But unlike the Great Pyramid, which sits on a massive bedrock foundation in the desert, Nan Madol sits in the water. How do you transport millions of tons of incredibly dense volcanic rock across the ocean? If you cut down a tree, you can float it on the water. If you drop a basalt log into the water, it sinks instantly like a bowling ball. The mainstream theory suggests the builders tied the heavy stone columns to bamboo rafts and floated them miles around the island to the construction site. However, when modern researchers attempted to recreate this using scaled-down rocks and traditional rafts, the heavy density of the basalt easily swamped and sank the rafts. And even if they did miraculously manage to float a 50-ton rock over a delicate coral reef, how did they hoist it out of the water and lift it 50 feet into the air to place it neatly on a wall? You cannot build massive wooden cranes on the site because the site is just water and fragile coral. There is no solid ground to brace the heavy lifting equipment. Adding another layer of strange science to this mystery is the nature of the rock itself. Basalt contains high levels of iron and magnesium, making it heavily magnetic. If you bring a compass near the walls of Nan Madol, the needle will spin erratically, confused by the magnetic fields trapped inside the stone columns. Local Pohnpeian legends do not talk about bamboo rafts or slaves pulling ropes. Their oral history claims that the city was built by twin sorcerers named Olisipa and Olosopa. According to the legend, these brothers used magic to make the massive, heavy magnetic stones fly through the air like birds and settle into place on the reef. In the ancient world, any technology that the common people did not understand was described as magic. Could this local legend be a distorted memory of a highly advanced, lost technology? As we will explore later in our journey, the manipulation of acoustic resonance, magnetic fields, and levitation are recurring themes in ancient megalithic building. Were they utilizing the natural magnetic properties of the basalt to manipulate its weight? Whether we are looking at the mortarless, earthquake-proof puzzle walls of the Andes or the impossible, floating basalt city in the Pacific, a clear pattern is emerging. These are not isolated anomalies. They are remnants of a worldwide engineering epoch that operated on principles of physics we are only just beginning to comprehend. Our ancestors were manipulating materials with extreme density, hardness, and weight in ways that render our current historical timeline obsolete. But manipulating giant stones is only one side of the coin. The true depth of their scientific knowledge becomes even more apparent when we scale down from massive architecture to intricate, impossible machinery. In the next chapter, we will open the vault on ancient mechanical engineering and discover evidence that electricity, computing, and precision manufacturing existed thousands of years before the Industrial Revolution. So far, our journey has focused on the massive, the megalithic stones that weigh hundreds of tons, and the gargantuan walls designed to withstand the violent shaking of the earth. It is easy to look at those massive structures and assume that ancient builders were simply masters of brute force and grand scale. But to truly understand the depth of their lost knowledge, we need to completely shift our perspective. We must zoom in from the macro to the micro. When we look at the smaller artifacts left behind, we do not find primitive trinkets. Instead, we find intricate, precise mechanical engineering and the undeniable utilization of electrical power. Our first stop in this microscopic exploration takes us to the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea. In the spring of 1900, a group of Greek sponge divers was blown off course by a severe storm. They sought shelter near a tiny rocky island called Antikythera. When the storm passed, they decided to dive in the uncharted waters and stumbled upon a massive ancient Roman shipwreck. The ship was essentially a luxury cargo vessel from antiquity, packed with beautiful bronze and marble statues, glassware, and coins dating back to around 60 BC. Among these magnificent treasures, the divers recovered what looked like a useless, calcified lump of rock and wood. It was the size of a large dictionary, heavily corroded, and completely ignored by archaeologists for months. But as the wooden exterior began to dry out and split, it revealed something impossible. A highly complex, precisely manufactured system of interlocking bronze gears. This object is now known as the Antikythera Mechanism. To understand why this artifact completely breaks the standard timeline of history, we have to look at what mainstream science tells us about technology. We are taught that complex interlocking gear systems, the kind needed to build a reliable mechanical clock, were not invented until the 14th century in Europe. Yet, here is a device from ancient Greece, built over 1,500 years earlier, that is significantly more advanced than any medieval clock. Finding the Antikythera mechanism in a 2,000-year-old shipwreck is exactly like cracking open a sealed ancient Egyptian tomb and finding a fully functional, intricately crafted Swiss Rolex watch sitting on a table. It simply should not exist in that era. Modern scientists have spent decades using advanced 3D X-ray microtomography to see inside the calcified rock without breaking it. What they found is staggering. The device contains at least 30 surviving bronze gears, originally housed in a wooden box with a hand crank on the side. The gear teeth are cut with mathematical perfection, designed to mesh flawlessly without jamming. But it is not just a clock. It is the world's first known analog computer. When a user turned the hand crank, the complex train of gears would calculate and display the exact positions of the sun, the moon, and the 5 planets known in antiquity. It tracked the lunar phases and could perfectly predict both solar and lunar eclipses decades in advance. It even had a dial to track the 4-year cycle of the ancient Olympic Games. The most shocking part of its design is the inclusion of a differential gear. This is a mechanical engineering concept that allows 2 shafts to rotate at different speeds. In our modern world, the differential gear is a crucial component in the axle of every single automobile on the road, allowing your car's wheels to spin at different speeds when you turn a corner. Historically, the differential gear was supposedly invented in the 1800s. Yet, the builders of the Antikythera mechanism were using it thousands of years ago to model the elliptical, non-circular orbit of the moon. The Antikythera mechanism proves that ancient people possessed an incredibly high level of metallurgical skill, mathematics, and mechanical logic. It was not a prototype. It was a highly refined, miniaturized piece of technology. And just as you cannot build a modern smartphone without first inventing electricity, circuit boards, and coding, you cannot build the Antikythera mechanism without a long, unrecorded history of advanced mechanical engineering. It represents a peak of technology that was somehow entirely lost and forgotten for over a millennium. If the Antikythera mechanism forces us to rewrite the history of mechanical computing, our next artifact forces us to rewrite the history of energy itself. We are leaving the Mediterranean and traveling east to the deserts of modern-day Iraq, near the ancient city of Babylon. In 1938, a German archaeologist named Wilhelm König was working at the National Museum of Iraq. While sorting through a collection of artifacts excavated from a 2,000-year-old Parthian village near Baghdad, he noticed something very peculiar. It was a simple, unassuming yellow clay jar, about 6 inches tall. But it was what was inside the jar that made König freeze in his tracks. Inside the clay jar was a hollow cylinder made of rolled sheet copper. Suspended perfectly in the center of that copper cylinder was a solid iron rod. The iron rod was isolated from the copper by a plug made of asphalt, the very same material we use to pave roads today. And the iron rod showed heavy signs of corrosion, specifically the kind of corrosion caused by acid. To the untrained eye, it looks like a strange jar for storing scrolls. But to anyone with a basic understanding of chemistry, the design is unmistakable. It is a galvanic cell. It is a battery. Mainstream history firmly states that the battery was invented by an Italian physicist named Alessandro Volta in the year 1800. Volta discovered that if you place 2 different types of metals into a liquid that can conduct electricity, known as an electrolyte, a chemical reaction occurs that forces electrons to flow from one metal to the other. That flow of electrons is electricity. Let us break down the Baghdad Battery using a classic science experiment you might have seen in a high school classroom. The lemon battery. If you stick a galvanized iron nail and a copper penny into a lemon, the citric acid in the lemon juice acts as the electrolyte. The chemical reaction between the acid, the iron, and the copper generates a small electric current. The Baghdad Battery is exactly the same concept, but engineered as a permanent functional tool. The clay jar was the casing. The copper cylinder and the iron rod were the two dissimilar metals. The asphalt plug acted as an insulator to keep the metals from touching and short-circuiting. All the ancient user had to do was pour an acidic liquid, like grape juice, lemon juice, or wine vinegar, into the jar. Instantly, the device would begin producing an electrical charge. Modern scientists and engineers, including the team from the famous television show Mythbusters, have built exact replicas of the Baghdad Battery. When they filled their replicas with lemon juice, the ancient devices successfully produced around 1.5 to 2 volts of electricity. If you wire several of these clay jars together in a series, just like linking modern AA batteries in a flashlight, you can multiply that voltage significantly. But what would ancient people in Mesopotamia do with electricity? They obviously were not powering televisions or charging smartphones. The most logical, scientifically grounded answer lies in a process called electroplating. Electroplating is a technique used in jewelry making, where you use an electrical current to transfer a microscopic layer of a precious metal, like gold, onto a cheaper metal, like silver or copper. It is how cheap, gold-plated jewelry is mass-produced today. There are numerous artifacts from ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt, such as silver statues and copper vases, that are coated in a layer of gold so thin and flawless that it could not have been painted or hammered on. It looks exactly like modern electroplating. Other researchers suggest a more physiological use. In the ancient world, medicine and religion were deeply intertwined. A doctor or a priest might have used a mild electric shock from a linked series of these batteries to treat nerve pain or stimulate muscles. A primitive form of electrotherapy still used by physical therapists today. Or perhaps they were used in religious temples. Imagine a priest wiring these batteries to a metal statue of a god. When a worshiper touches the statue, they receive a sudden, invisible jolt of energy, a divine touch manufactured by chemical electricity. Regardless of exactly how it was used, the Baghdad Battery provides physical, undeniable proof that humanity understood the principles of electricity millennia before the Industrial Revolution. They knew how to harness chemical reactions to generate invisible, flowing power. When you look at the Antikythera Mechanism and the Baghdad Battery side by side, a profound picture of the past emerges. These ancestors were not just stacking heavy rocks. They were calculating the cosmos with precision bronze gears and generating electrical currents in clay jars. They had mastered both the heavy, macro world of megalithic construction and the delicate, micro world of physics and chemistry. But this understanding of mechanics and power naturally leads to an even more perplexing question. If they possessed this level of sophisticated knowledge, how did they apply it to the hard, unyielding stone we saw in Part 1? How did they manufacture the impossible precision of Puma Punku? In our next chapter, we will look at the tools themselves. We will explore the evidence of high-speed machining, advanced core drilling, and a fragile aerodynamic disc that completely shatters our understanding of ancient Egyptian capabilities. Having seen the undeniable evidence of mechanical computing and chemical electricity, a massive question remains. If these ancient civilizations possessed a profound understanding of physics, how did they apply it to the physical world around them? How did they manufacture the impossible megaliths we explored earlier? To find the answer, we have to look closely at the tool marks left behind. We are heading back to Egypt, but we are not going to look at the massive pyramids. Instead, we are going to look at the discarded scraps, the broken stones, and the seemingly insignificant holes left in the bedrock. When you hear about ancient Egyptian construction, the standard history books give you a very specific toolkit: copper chisels, wooden mallets, and round pounding stones made of dolerite. We are told that millions of tons of limestone and granite were shaped by thousands of workers endlessly chipping away, day after day. But when you examine certain artifacts under a magnifying glass, that primitive toolkit becomes a mechanical impossibility. All across Egypt, at sites like Karnak, Abu Sir, and the Giza Plateau, there are massive blocks of granite, diorite, and basalt that feature perfectly round, smooth holes drilled straight into them. To understand why this is anomalous, we need to understand how drilling works. If you want to make a hole in a piece of wood, you use a solid drill bit that grinds away all the material inside the hole, turning it into sawdust. But if you want to cut a large hole through something extremely hard and thick, like a concrete wall or a thick glass pane, a solid drill bit is terribly inefficient. Instead, modern engineers use a core drill. A core drill is essentially a hollow metal tube with cutting teeth on the bottom edge. It works exactly like a hole saw you might use to cut a perfectly round hole in a wooden door for a new doorknob. The hollow tube spins, cutting only the outer perimeter of the hole and leaving a solid cylinder, or core, of material in the center, which is then snapped off and removed. The ancient Egyptians were undeniably using core drills. We have found the holes, and we have found the discarded, perfectly cylindrical granite cores. But here is the problem. What were the drills made of, and how were they powered? Remember the Mohs scale of hardness. Copper, the hardest metal officially available to the early Egyptians, is a 3. Granite contains high amounts of quartz, which sits at a 7. Diorite is even harder. You cannot cut quartz with copper. The copper will just melt and deform against the rock. The standard archaeological explanation is that the Egyptians used a flat-edged copper tube and poured quartz, sand, and water beneath it. The idea is that the workers would spin the copper tube back and forth by hand with a bow, and the loose sand would act as an abrasive, slowly grinding a circular groove into the granite. While this method can technically scratch granite over a very long time, it completely fails to explain the physical evidence found inside the drill holes. When you look at the walls of these ancient holes and the sides of the extracted granite cores, you do not see smooth, random scratches from loose sand being rubbed back and forth. You see a continuous, perfectly parallel helical spiral groove running from the top of the hole to the bottom. It looks exactly like the thread on a metal screw. In the late 19th century, The legendary British engineer and Egyptologist Sir William Matthew Flinders Petrie spent years analyzing these drill marks. Petrie realized that a continuous spiral groove means the drill was biting deeply into the rock and pulling itself downward with every single rotation. In machining, this is called the feed rate. By measuring the distance between the spiral threads, Petrie calculated the feed rate of these ancient drills. What he found shocked him. The drill was sinking into the solid granite at a rate of 1/10 of an inch per revolution. To achieve that kind of deep, aggressive cut into diamond-hard rock, a bow-driven copper tube with loose sand is useless. According to modern mechanical engineers, to recreate that exact feed rate today, you would need a core drill embedded with industrial diamonds, spinning at thousands of revolutions per minute, RPM, with an estimated 2 tons of continuous downward pressure pushing the machine into the stone. Let that sink in. 2 tons of pressure, rotating at high speeds, biting into solid granite like a hot knife through butter. You cannot achieve this with a hand-cranked wooden bow. It requires mechanized, high-torque machinery. Some modern engineers have even suggested the spiral grooves bear a striking resemblance to marks left by ultrasonic drilling, a modern technology where the drill bit vibrates tens of thousands of times per second, using sound waves and an abrasive slurry to effortlessly vaporize hard materials. Whatever the exact technology was, the drill holes in Egypt are fossilized proof of advanced, high-speed rotary machining. But if the ability to drill through granite shows an incredible mastery of brute force and speed, our next artifact shows an impossible mastery of delicacy and aerodynamic design. In 1936, the British Egyptologist Walter Bryan Emery was excavating the burial ground of Saqqara. He was digging in the tomb of Prince Sabu, a high-ranking official from the First Dynasty, dating back to around 3000 BC. In the center of the tomb, surrounded by typical ancient artifacts like clay pots and flint knives, Emery found an object that looked like it had been dropped by a time traveler. It is known today as the schist disk of Sabu. At first glance, it looks like a steering wheel or a bizarre hubcap. It is a circular disk, about 24 inches in diameter, but it is incredibly thin. Less than half an inch thick in some places. It has a raised hub in the center with a hole, exactly like the center of a modern wheel designed to slide onto a metal axle. But the most baffling feature is the outer edge. The rim of the disk is folded into 3 distinct, beautifully curved symmetrical lobes that sweep inward toward the center. The mainstream explanation is that this was a decorative vase, an incense burner, or perhaps a symbolic object meant to hold a central pillar. But anyone who has ever studied engineering, fluid dynamics, or aeronautics looks at the Sabu disk and instantly recognizes it for what it truly is: an impeller. An impeller is a rotating device used to alter the flow and pressure of a fluid or a gas. If you take apart the water pump in your car, the jet engine of an airplane, or even the blender in your kitchen, you will find an impeller. The 3 sweeping lobes of the Sabu disk are aerodynamically perfect. If you were to mount this disk on a central axle and spin it at high speeds inside a housing, it would function incredibly well as a centrifugal pump, aggressively moving water or chemical gases with maximum efficiency and minimal cavitation, the formation of damaging bubbles. But the true impossibility of the Sabu disk lies in the material it is made of. The disk is carved out of a rock called schist, specifically a type of metasilt stone. Schist is a heavily foliated metamorphic rock. This means it is made of microscopic, flat layers tightly compressed together. It is incredibly brittle. If you hit it, it does not dent. It flakes, splinters, and shatters along its layers, much like a piece of dry slate roofing tile. Imagine taking a fragile, flaky piece of slate and trying to carve it into the shape of a modern boat propeller using nothing but a copper chisel and a pounding stone. It is absurd. You would shatter the stone 100 times over before you even got close to the sweeping, paper-thin aerodynamic curves of the Sabu disk. Carving this shape out of schist requires a highly advanced, gentle, three-dimensional milling process, perhaps something akin to modern CNC machining or chemical etching. Why would someone go to the painstaking, nearly impossible effort of carving a perfectly functional, mathematically symmetrical aerodynamic impeller out of incredibly fragile stone? In the ancient world, stone was often used to create permanent, everlasting copies of everyday objects. Is the Sabu disk a replica? Is it a fragile stone cargo cult copy of a functional metal machine that belonged to a much older, lost civilization? If a primitive tribe found a crashed helicopter, they might carve a replica of its rotor blade out of wood to worship it. Did the ancient Egyptians do the same thing with a piece of high-tech machinery they found, but could no longer reproduce in metal? When we look at the high-speed drill holes in the granite of Abusir and the aerodynamic perfection of the Sabu disk, the picture of the past becomes undeniably clear. Our ancestors possessed mechanized rotary tools and a deep understanding of fluid dynamics. They knew how to manipulate shapes to control the flow of energy, air, and water. And if they understood the aerodynamics required to build a functioning impeller, we must ask the next inevitable question. Did they look to the sky? Did this lost civilization use their knowledge of power, machinery, and aerodynamics to leave the ground entirely? In our next chapter, we will open the ancient blueprints and decode the terrifying reality of prehistoric aviation and the ancient weapons that could melt solid rock into glass. Having seen the aerodynamic perfection of the Sabu disk, we are forced to ask a logical question. If ancient engineers understood fluid dynamics well enough to carve a fragile stone impeller, did they also understand how to navigate the ultimate fluid? The air? In our modern world, the leap from understanding the flow of water to understanding the flow of wind is what gave us the airplane. Mainstream history insists that human flight began in 1903 with the Wright brothers on a windy beach in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. But if we look at ancient texts and physical artifacts without the blinders of traditional academia, we find terrifyingly precise descriptions and models of advanced aviation that predate the Wright brothers by thousands of years. To explore the reality of ancient flight, we first travel to the Indian subcontinent. India is home to some of the oldest and most voluminous ancient texts in the world, primarily the Vedas and the great epics like the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. For centuries, Western historians have categorized these texts as mythological poetry, beautiful stories of gods riding magical flying chariots pulled by celestial horses. But when you actually read the translations of these texts with a modern, technological mindset, the magical chariots suddenly sound like heavily classified aerospace engineering reports. In these ancient Sanskrit texts, the flying machines are called Vimanas. They are not described as fluffy clouds or mythical beasts. The texts go to great lengths to describe them as physical, metallic vehicles made of specific alloys. They detail the sounds they made, the exhaust they produced, and the way they maneuvered. Let us look at a specific text called the Vaimanika Shastra, which translates roughly to the science of aeronautics. Even if we debate the exact age of this specific manuscript, the contents are mind-boggling. It reads exactly like a flight manual or a modern Boeing maintenance guide. It describes different types of Vimanas, some shaped like saucers, others like long cylinders, very similar to modern cigar-shaped aircraft or rockets. The text details the materials required to build the hull, specifically mentioning heat-absorbing metals designed to withstand the friction of atmospheric flight. But the most incredible detail is the propulsion system. The texts describe engines powered by rotating liquid mercury. To the average person in the 19th century, this sounded like pure fantasy. But to a modern physicist, it sounds suspiciously like a mercury vortex engine or an ion thruster. If you take liquid mercury, pressurize it, and spin it rapidly inside a closed circular ring using electromagnetic fields, you create a highly unstable, high-energy plasma. This is not magic. This is high-level physics, similar to how we generate massive magnetic fields in modern MRI machines or experimental particle accelerators. According to the ancient blueprints, spinning this mercury vortex created a powerful gyroscopic effect and an anti-gravitational thrust, allowing the Vimana to lift straight up into the air. The flight characteristics described in the epics perfectly match what modern engineers call VTOL, vertical takeoff and landing. Just like a modern Harrier jump jet or a consumer quadcopter drone, the Vimanas did not need a long runway. The texts describe them rising straight up, hovering in place, and then darting off at blinding speeds, leaving a glowing trail of fire and a roaring noise that caused elephants to run in panic. If you have ever stood near an airport tarmac when a modern military fighter jet engages its afterburners, you know exactly what that panic-inducing roar sounds like. The ancients were not describing angry gods. They were describing the immense acoustic shockwave of a jet turbine. If the texts in India give us the flight manuals, the tombs of South America give us the wind tunnel models. Leaving India, we cross the globe to the modern-day country of Colombia. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, archaeologists excavating the tombs of the ancient Quimbaya civilization, dating back around 1,000 to 2,000 years, discovered hundreds of small, intricate gold artifacts. Most of these golden trinkets were shaped like obvious insects, frogs, and jaguars. But among them were about a dozen specific models that did not look like anything found in nature. Mainstream archaeologists labeled them zoomorphic, meaning animal-shaped, and tossed them into museum displays under the assumption that they were heavily stylized birds or moths. But in the 1990s, aerospace engineers and aviation experts took a closer look at the Quimbaya artifacts, specifically the ones found in the Tolima region. When an aerospace engineer looks at these golden trinkets, they do not see a bird. They see a highly evolved aerodynamic fighter jet. Let us break down the physical differences between a bird and an airplane. A bird has a head, wings covered in feathers, and a tail that spreads out horizontally to catch the air. A bird does not have a vertical tail fin. The Tolima artifacts, however, possess features that are strictly mechanical and aerodynamically deliberate. They feature a thick, mechanical-looking fuselage, the main body of the aircraft. Instead of curved bird wings, they have perfectly straight delta wings located at the bottom of the fuselage, a design identical to the supersonic Concorde or modern stealth fighters, built to reduce drag at high speeds. At the rear of the Golden models, things get even more undeniable. They feature horizontal stabilizers, the small wings at the back of a plane, that are perfectly flush and flat. Most importantly, they feature a strict upright vertical tail fin. In aviation, a vertical stabilizer is absolute necessary to prevent the aircraft from swinging side to side, known as yaw. No insect or bird on Earth possesses a rigid, upright vertical tail fin. Only man-made aircraft do. To prove that these were not just coincidental artistic shapes, in 1997, two German aviation pioneers, Peter Belting and Konrad Lubbers, conducted a practical experiment. They took the exact dimensions and proportions of the Kimbaya golden artifact and scaled it up 16 times to create a radio-controlled model. They did not alter the shape of the wings or the tail. They simply built a larger, lightweight copy and attached a propeller and an engine to the front. When they took it to an airfield, the results were astonishing. The model did not just fly, it flew flawlessly. The aerodynamic design was so stable and precise that the remote-controlled plane could perform complex aerial maneuvers, including barrel rolls and loops, and land gracefully. You cannot take a random lump of gold shaped like a moth, scale it up, and expect it to fly like a high-performance aircraft. The Quimbaya artifacts represent a deep mathematical understanding of aerodynamics, the laws of lift, drag, thrust, and weight. They are scale models of machines that once ruled the skies of the ancient world. The evidence of ancient aviation is not limited to text and gold. Sometimes it is carved directly into the stone walls of our most famous monuments. For our final stop in this chapter, we return to Egypt, to the magnificent temple of Seti I in the ancient city of Abydos. In 1998, visitors to the temple noticed something bizarre carved into the stone lintel high above the floor. There, clear as day, is a panel of hieroglyphs that looks like it belongs in a modern military hangar. The carvings unmistakably show three distinct modern vehicles. On the top left, there is a perfect profile of a modern helicopter. You can clearly see the main rotor blade on top, the cockpit in the front, and the distinct tail boom extending to the rear. Below it, there is a carving that looks exactly like a modern hovercraft or a heavily armored tank, complete with a gun barrel. Next to that, there is a shape that perfectly mirrors a sleek, aerodynamic lifting body glider or a futuristic spaceship. The mainstream academic explanation for the Abydos helicopter is a process called palimpsest. This happens when an original carving is plastered over and a new carving is chipped into the same stone. Over thousands of years, the plaster falls out, and the two separate carvings overlap to create a new accidental image. Egyptologists argue that the name of Pharaoh Seti I was simply carved over with the name of his son, Ramesses II. While palimpsest is a real archaeological phenomenon, let us apply basic statistical probability to this specific explanation. Imagine taking a typewriter and typing a random sentence. Then, you roll the paper back, close your eyes, and type another random sentence over the first one. What are the chances that the overlapping, jumbled letters will accidentally form the perfect, incredibly detailed blueprints of a modern helicopter, a tank, and a glider, all parked right next to each other? The statistical probability is practically zero. It is like throwing a bowl of alphabet soup at the wall and having it perfectly spell out aerospace engineering. Even if it is a palimpsest, the overlapping lines created a visual representation of technology that supposedly would not exist for another 3,000 years. Whether it is a miraculous coincidence of overlapping stone, a prophetic vision of the future, or a deliberate carving of ancient vehicles, the image stands as another glaring anomaly. When you combine the detailed engineering manuals of the Indian Vimanas, the wind tunnel-tested aerodynamics of the South American gold flyers, and the undeniable visual profiles carved into an Egyptian temple, a single truth emerges. The sky was not a barrier to our ancient ancestors. They understood how to conquer gravity. But the ability to fly brings a dark consequence. Throughout our own modern history, the moment we conquered the air, we immediately militarized it. The airplane was quickly followed by the aerial bomb. Did the ancient world follow the same destructive path? If they had advanced flying machines, did they also possess the advanced weaponry to match? In our next chapter, we will travel to the sites of ancient, unexplainable devastation to uncover the terrifying evidence of prehistoric nuclear war. If the ancient world possessed advanced aerodynamics and flying machines, human nature dictates an uncomfortable, inevitable next step. In our own modern timeline, the moment we conquered the air, we immediately weaponized it. The invention of the airplane was quickly followed by the invention of the aerial bomb, culminating in the ultimate weapon of mass destruction: the nuclear warhead. If history is truly a cycle, and a lost civilization possessed flight, did they also possess the means to destroy themselves? To answer this, we must look for the physical scars left on the Earth itself, places where the ground was subjected to temperatures so extreme that they defy any natural explanation. Our investigation takes us first to one of the most inhospitable places on the planet, the Great Sand Sea, spanning the border between modern-day Egypt and Libya. In this vast, empty expanse of the Sahara Desert, scientists and explorers have found thousands of pieces of a very strange, beautiful material scattered across the dunes. It is translucent, yellow-green, and incredibly pure. It is known as Libyan desert glass. To understand the mystery of this glass, we have to look at the legendary Pharaoh Tutankhamun. When British archaeologist Howard Carter opened King Tut's tomb in 1922, he found a magnificent golden breastplate featuring a carved scarab beetle sitting right in the center. For decades, experts thought the scarab was made of chalcedony, a common gemstone. But in the late 1990s, an Italian mineralogist proved that King Tut's scarab was actually carved from a piece of Libyan desert glass. The presence of the glass in a royal tomb is fascinating, but the real mystery is how the glass was created in the first place. Let us look at the basic chemistry of glassmaking. To turn ordinary beach or desert sand into solid glass, you need to expose it to immense, sustained heat. Specifically, temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. In nature, there are only a few ways this can happen. The first is a lightning strike. When lightning hits the sand, it can melt a very small, thin tube of glass called a fulgurite. but fulgurites are tiny, usually the size of a pencil. The Libyan desert glass is found in massive chunks, some weighing over 50 pounds, scattered over an area of 2,500 square miles. The second natural way is volcanic activity, but there are absolutely no volcanoes anywhere near this part of the Sahara. The mainstream scientific explanation is that a massive meteorite hit the desert. The immense kinetic energy of the impact would theoretically generate enough flash heat to melt the sand into glass. However, there is a glaring flaw in this theory. There is no crater. A meteorite large enough to melt thousands of square miles of sand would leave a massive, undeniable hole in the earth, much like the famous meteor crater in Arizona. But in the Great Sand Sea, the ground beneath the dunes is perfectly flat bedrock. To find a true, modern equivalent to the Libyan desert glass, we have to look away from nature and look at our own darkest military achievements. On July 16, 1945, the United States military detonated the world's first atomic bomb in the desert of New Mexico. The Trinity test. The immense, unnatural heat of the nuclear fireball instantly melted the desert sand below it. When the scientists returned to the site, they found the ground covered in a radioactive green glass that they named trinitite. When you place a piece of trinitite next to a piece of Libyan desert glass, they are practically identical in their chemical makeup. Both were created by a rapid, intense thermal pulse that flash-melted the silica in the sand. If there was no volcano and no meteor crater in the Sahara, what generated a localized burst of heat rivaling a nuclear blast thousands of years ago? Some alternative researchers propose that an ancient, high-yield energy weapon was detonated in the atmosphere, an air burst that scorched the earth below without leaving a crater, exactly like how modern nuclear weapons are designed to detonate in the air to maximize their destructive shockwave. As terrifying as this theory is, the Libyan desert is completely empty. What happens when this kind of inexplicable, weaponized heat is unleashed on a populated city? To see the human cost of this forgotten technology, we must leave the deserts of Egypt and travel east to the Sindh province of modern-day Pakistan. Here, in the valley of the Indus River, lie the sprawling ruins of Mohenjo-Daro. Dating back over 4,500 years, Mohenjo-Daro was a marvel of ancient urban planning. It was a bustling metropolis built on a precise mathematical grid, featuring multi-story brick houses, advanced underground sewage systems, and even indoor plumbing that rivaled 18th-century Europe. But Mohenjo-Daro did not slowly decline like the Roman Empire. It appears to have been wiped out in a single catastrophic instant. When early archaeologists excavated the streets of the city, they did not find a civilization that had peacefully packed up and moved away. They found a scene of sudden, absolute horror. Skeletons were found scattered directly in the streets. In one famous excavation area, researchers found a family, a father, mother, and a child, holding hands, lying in the street, crushed beneath the debris. These people were not formally buried in graves. They were struck down violently and suddenly while going about their daily lives. Mainstream historians initially suggested the city was invaded by a foreign army. However, closer inspection of the skeletons revealed a massive contradiction. There were no battle wounds. There were no sword cuts, no arrowheads stuck in the bones, and no signs of hand-to-hand combat. Furthermore, the skeletons were found among extreme structural damage that no primitive army could cause. At the epicenter of the city, archaeologists found evidence of a phenomenon called vitrification. Vitrification is the process where stone or clay is subjected to such extreme heat that it actually melts, bubbles, and turns into a glassy substance. We see this at Mohenjo-Daro. There are thick clay pots that have been melted and fused together. There are solid stone walls that look as if they have been scorched by a massive blowtorch, turning the outer layer of the brick into smooth glass. Again, let us apply everyday physics. You cannot vitrify a brick with a wood fire. If you build a massive bonfire and throw a clay brick into it, the brick will simply get hot and covered in soot. To melt clay and stone into glass, you need instantaneous heat exceeding 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. It is the equivalent of placing a brick inside an industrial blast furnace. How did an ancient city experience a localized city-destroying heat wave that melted stone and instantly killed the population in the streets? Some independent researchers and Soviet scientists who examined the site in the mid-20th century reported another chilling detail. The skeletons and the surrounding vitrified stones allegedly showed elevated levels of background radiation, heavily concentrated at a specific epicenter in the city, exactly as if a blast had occurred there and radiated outward. When we look for context to explain this physical devastation, we do not have to guess. We just have to look back at the ancient Indian texts we discussed in the previous chapter. The same epics that gave us the blueprints for the flying Vimanas also describe the terrifying weapons they carried. In the ancient Mahabharata, there is a description of a weapon called the Brahmastra. The text explicitly states that this was not a normal arrow or spear. It was a single projectile, charged with all the power of the universe. When it was fired, the text describes an explosion brighter than 1,000 suns. It talks about a massive pillar of smoke and fire that rose into the sky, completely blotting out the sun. But it is the aftermath detailed in the text that sends a chill down the spine of any modern reader. The text describes how the heat from the weapon was so intense that water boiled and fish were burned alive in the rivers. It states that the warriors who survived the initial blast threw themselves into the water to wash their armor, because a deadly, invisible poison had settled over everything. The text notes that in the days following the blast, the survivors' hair and fingernails began to fall out, their food was poisoned, and the birds turned white. Anyone who has studied modern history knows exactly what this text is describing. Hair falling out, fingernails dropping off, and poisoned environments are the exact textbook clinical symptoms of acute radiation sickness. It is the exact same medical reality that the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki faced in 1945. How could ancient poets, living thousands of years before the discovery of the atom, perfectly describe the visual horrors of a nuclear mushroom cloud and the specific biological symptoms of radiation poisoning? The correlation is too precise to be ignored. The melted glass in the Libyan desert, the vitrified stones of Mohenjo-Daro, and the chillingly accurate descriptions of radiation sickness in ancient texts all point to the same terrifying conclusion. The straight line of history is broken. A highly advanced global civilization existed. They mastered megalithic engineering, they understood the physics of flight, and ultimately, they unlocked the destructive power of the universe. And like a reset button being pressed on a computer, their profound technological peak was wiped out by a cataclysm, whether man-made or natural. But if everything was destroyed, how do we explain the surviving structures? What if the survivors of this great cataclysm realized the folly of destructive weapons and turned to a different, more harmonious form of science to rebuild? In our next chapter, we will step away from destruction and explore the invisible, healing forces of the earth. We will uncover how ancient builders used the power of sound, acoustic resonance, and the planet's own magnetic grid to manipulate matter and elevate human consciousness. As we step away from the terrifying scars of ancient destruction, we have to wonder how the survivors, or perhaps an entirely different epoch of builders, chose to rebuild. If they moved away from the brute force of explosive energy, what did they use instead? The answer lies in an invisible, universal force that we interact with every single day, yet rarely think of as a physical tool: sound. Today, we listen to music for entertainment. But thousands of years ago, sound was not just art. It was a highly developed branch of physics. Our ancestors understood that sound is a mechanical wave, a vibration of physical pressure traveling through the air or through solid objects. And if you know how to control that pressure, you can alter the human mind and manipulate the physical world. To understand this, we do not need complex physics formulas. We just need to look at everyday acoustic resonance. Have you ever sung a random note while standing in the shower? And suddenly, that specific note sounds incredibly loud, causing the whole bathroom to vibrate and boom? That happens because the sound wave you created perfectly matches the physical dimensions of the room. The sound bounces back and forth, multiplying its own energy. Or think about an opera singer shattering a crystal glass. The singer is not using physical force. They are singing the exact resonant frequency of the glass. The invisible sound waves physically shake the atomic structure of the glass until it breaks. Now, imagine taking that basic concept and scaling it up into massive, megalithic architecture. Our first stop is a tiny island nation in the Mediterranean Sea called Malta. Hidden beneath the modern streets lies a massive, 3-level subterranean complex known as the Hal Saflieni Hypogem. Dating back over 5,000 years, this underground labyrinth was carved directly out of solid limestone. When archaeologists first explored the hypogeum, they found something deeply unsettling. The entire complex acts as a giant underground acoustic speaker. But there is one specific room, carved in a circular shape, known as the oracle chamber. If a man stands in a small alcove in this chamber and speaks in a deep, low voice, his words do not just echo. They are acoustically magnified and projected throughout the entire 3-story underground complex, vibrating through the solid stone with terrifying clarity. However, if a woman speaks in a higher pitch, the sound barely travels at all. The room was mathematically engineered to amplify only specific, low-frequency sound waves. In the late 1990s, an international team of acousticians and scientists decided to test the oracle chamber using advanced sound measuring equipment. They discovered that the room possesses a very specific, dominant resonant frequency. Exactly 111 hertz. You might think that is just a random number, a coincidence of cave dimensions. But let us leave the underground caves of Malta and travel back to the towering Giza Plateau in Egypt. Deep inside the Great Pyramid of Giza lies the King's Chamber. This room is built entirely out of massive, perfectly smooth blocks of red granite. Inside the room sits a single, lidless granite box, often called a sarcophagus, though no mummy was ever found inside it. When acoustic engineers tested the king's chamber and the granite box, they found something that completely defies coincidence. The resonant frequency of the granite box and the chamber itself is also exactly 111 hertz. Why 111 hertz? Why would builders separated by thousands of miles and supposedly thousands of years engineer their most sacred massive structures to vibrate at this exact acoustic pitch? The answer is not found in archaeology. It is found in modern neurology and brain chemistry. In the early 2000s, medical researchers at UCLA conducted a study using EEG and MRI machines to map the human brain when exposed to different sound frequencies. When they subjected volunteers to the frequency of 111 hertz, the brain scans showed a sudden, dramatic shift. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for logical thinking, anxiety, and our sense of ego, essentially switched off. At the same time, the right hemisphere of the brain, associated with deep intuition, emotional healing, and profound trance states, lit up. By exposing the human body to 111 hertz, you force the brain out of its normal, high-stress waking state, beta waves, and plunge it directly into a deep meditative state, alpha and theta waves. The ancient builders of Malta and Egypt did not build these chambers as simple tombs. They built massive architectural biofeedback machines. They understood the neurological impact of acoustics. By singing, chanting, or playing instruments at that exact frequency inside these granite and limestone amplifiers, they were deliberately altering human consciousness, allowing for rapid healing, deep meditation, or perhaps even a chemically induced connection to a higher state of awareness. But if they could use sound to move the human mind, could they also use it to move physical matter? This brings us to the ultimate mystery of ancient megalithic construction: acoustic levitation. Let us return to the massive, impossible stones we discussed in Part 1, the 1,000-ton blocks of Baalbek and the precision-cut, mortarless walls of Sacsayhuaman. We have already proven that wooden rollers and hemp ropes violate the laws of physics when dealing with that kind of weight. But what if the secret to lifting those stones was not physical friction, but acoustic pressure? In modern laboratories today, acoustic levitation is a proven scientific reality. Scientists use machines called ultrasonic transducers. Imagine two powerful microscopic stereo speakers facing each other, pointing up and down. By blasting high-frequency sound waves directly at each other, the waves collide in the middle and create what is called a standing wave. Inside a standing wave, there are points of high acoustic pressure and points of zero pressure, known as nodes. The high-pressure areas act like invisible, solid shelves of air. Modern scientists can place drops of water, small insects, or lightweight foam balls into these nodes, and the objects will float perfectly in mid-air, trapped and suspended purely by the physical force of sound. Currently, our modern science can only levitate very small objects. But what if our ancestors simply scaled this technology up? To find evidence of this, we look to the oral traditions of Tibet. In the 1930s, a Swedish doctor named Jarl was invited deep into the Himalayas to treat a high-ranking Tibetan lama. While staying at a remote monastery, Dr. Jarl allegedly witnessed and documented something that modern science says is impossible. He was taken to a cliff face where a large, heavy stone block needed to be lifted to a cave entrance 250 meters up the mountain. There were no cranes, no ropes, and no wooden rollers. Instead, the monks set up a highly precise geometric formation. They arranged 19 musical instruments, specifically massive iron drums and long, heavy metal trumpets, in a perfect 90-degree arc, exactly 63 meters away from the stone block. According to Dr. Jarl's detailed account, the monks began to beat the drums and blow the trumpets in a very specific, rhythmic cadence. At first, nothing happened. But as the deafening, low-frequency sound waves built up and resonated against the cliff face, the massive stone block began to visibly vibrate. Then, incredibly, it lifted off the ground. Guided by the invisible pressure of the converging sound waves, the heavy block floated upward in a parabolic curve, rising steadily through the air until it landed safely on the ledge 250 meters above. Dr. Jarl reported that the monks used this exact acoustic method to lift several stones per hour. Mainstream historians quickly dismiss Dr. Jarl's account as an exotic myth or an optical illusion. But when you look at the precise measurements he recorded, the 90-degree arc, the exact distance of 63 meters, the specific combination of low-frequency drums and high-frequency trumpets, it reads exactly like a mathematical formula for creating a massive, localized acoustic standing wave. The cliff face itself would have acted as the top speaker, bouncing the sound waves back down to collide with the upward waves coming from the instruments, creating the very same high-pressure nodes that modern scientists use to levitate water droplets today. When you combine the medically proven, consciousness-altering chambers of Malta and Egypt with the Tibetan accounts of acoustic levitation, the silent ruins of the ancient world suddenly become deafeningly loud. Our ancestors were not primitive brutes hauling rocks. They were masters of frequency. They understood that everything in the universe, from the hardest granite to the human brain, is in a constant state of vibration. If you can control the vibration, you control the matter. But sound is only one half of the invisible energy equation. In our next chapter, we will look at the other half, electromagnetism. We will explore the hidden geometric grid that covers our planet and uncover the story of a frail, modern man who claimed to have rediscovered the ancient secrets of anti-gravity, using them to build a massive castle out of coral entirely by himself. As we explored in the previous chapter, acoustic resonance, the manipulation of sound waves, provided our ancestors with a powerful invisible tool for altering human consciousness and potentially even levitating massive stones. But sound is only one half of the energetic equation. To truly understand the impossible engineering of the ancient world, we must look at the other fundamental, invisible force that governs our universe. Electromagnetism. We use it every single day. It powers our Wi-Fi networks, guides our airplane compasses, and spins the electric motors in our cars. But while we use electricity to power microchips, the ancient builders may have tapped into the raw, planetary magnetic field itself. To understand how they did this, we need to completely change how we look at the Earth. Imagine holding a blank, unmarked globe. Now take a pushpin and stick it into the Great Pyramid of Giza in Egypt. Take another pin and place it on the Nazca Lines in Peru. Place another on the remote Easter Island in the Pacific Ocean. Keep going. pin the ancient ruins of Persepolis in Iran, the temples of Angkor Wat in Cambodia, and the radioactive ruins of Mohenjo-Daro in Pakistan. If you take a string and connect these specific ancient megalithic sites, they do not form a random, chaotic scribble. They form a perfectly straight, unbroken line that wraps entirely around the circumference of the Earth. Furthermore, this line sits at a mathematically perfect 30-degree angle to the equator. This is not a coincidence. This is what alternative researchers and geomagnetists refer to as the Earth grid, or ley lines. To understand the science behind the grid, think of the Earth not just as a giant ball of rock, but as a massive, spinning electrical dynamo. At its core, the Earth is filled with churning, liquid iron. This movement generates a massive electromagnetic field. Just like a standard bar magnet has invisible lines of magnetic force looping from its north pole to its south pole, the Earth has a complex geometric web of electromagnetic currents flowing beneath its surface and through its atmosphere. Where these invisible magnetic currents intersect and cross over one another, they create nodes, concentrated vortexes of natural electromagnetic energy. Think of them like the intersecting meridians in traditional acupuncture, but on a planetary scale. The ancient builders did not just wander around and pick random scenic spots to build their massive stone temples. They acted as planetary acupuncturists. They placed their most important, massive structures, especially those built from stones containing high amounts of crystalline quartz and magnetic iron, like granite and basalt, directly on top of these intersecting energy nodes. They were literally plugging their buildings into the grid. The pyramids and megalithic temples were not just tombs. They were massive static machines designed to harvest, amplify, and utilize the Earth's natural magnetic currents. You might think this sounds like pure science fiction, or perhaps a lost art buried thousands of years in the past. But what if I told you that in the early 20th century, right in the middle of a modern American suburb, one man claimed to have rediscovered this exact lost science? We are traveling away from the ancient ruins and heading to Homestead, Florida, to look at a modern megalithic mystery, Coral Castle. The architect of Coral Castle was not a team of highly educated engineers, nor was he an alien from another world. He was a single, frail Latvian immigrant named Edward Leedskalnin. In the 1920s, Ed stood barely 5 feet tall. He weighed exactly 100 pounds, and he suffered from terminal tuberculosis. He looked like a stiff wind could knock him over. Yet, between 1923 and 1951, this tiny, sickly man single-handedly quarried, carved, and moved over 1,100 tons of solid oolite coral rock to build a massive, intricate, open-air castle. To put this into perspective, the average weight of the stones Ed moved is greater than the massive blocks used to build the Great Pyramid of Giza. But Ed had no diesel cranes. He had no bulldozers. He had no teams of strongmen pulling hemp ropes. He worked entirely alone, mostly at night under the cover of darkness. He built towering walls, massive stone chairs, and an accurate sundial. The engineering precision at Coral Castle is staggering, rivaling the mortarless walls of Sacsayhuaman. Ed carved a towering obelisk weighing 28 tons and lifted it perfectly into place. He carved a crescent moon weighing 23 tons. But the most famous and baffling feature is the 9-ton revolving gate. Ed took a single massive block of coral weighing 18,000 pounds, He drilled a perfectly straight, 8-foot-long hole through the exact vertical center of the rock, a feat that is incredibly difficult to do without shattering the brittle coral. He rested this massive gate on a single metal gear salvaged from a Ford Model T truck. The alignment and weight distribution were so mathematically perfect that for decades, a small child could push the 9-ton stone door open with just one finger. It was entirely frictionless. When the metal bearing finally rusted and broke in the 1980s, it took a team of modern engineers with lasers and a 50-ton hydraulic crane several days to remove the door, fix the bearing, and put it back. Ed had installed it completely alone, with no heavy machinery. How did a 100-pound sick man achieve this? When people asked Ed how he moved the massive blocks, he did not claim magic or spiritual intervention. He gave a very specific, scientifically grounded answer. He stated on the record, "I have discovered the secrets of the pyramids and have found out how the Egyptians and the ancient builders in Peru, Yucatan, and Asia, with only primitive tools, raised and set in place blocks of stone weighing many tons." Ed left behind a series of self-published pamphlets detailing his theories on physics. He completely rejected the standard scientific model of atomic structure. Instead, he believed that all matter in the universe was fundamentally composed of individual magnetic currents, tiny, individual north and south pole magnets. Let us use a basic, everyday science metaphor to understand his theory. Think about taking two heavy-duty refrigerator magnets. If you try to push the two positive north poles together, they aggressively push each other apart. You can physically feel that invisible barrier of repulsion. In modern times, we use this exact principle to run maglev, magnetic levitation bullet trains in Japan. By using opposing magnetic fields, a 500-ton passenger train literally floats above the tracks, eliminating friction and allowing it to travel at over 300 miles per hour. Ed believed that the Earth itself is the ultima T-magnet. He theorized that if you could manipulate the internal magnetic currents inside a massive block of stone, aligning them to completely oppose the magnetic frequency of the Earth directly beneath it, the stone would effectively repel the ground. It would not just become lighter, it would achieve localized anti-gravity. You could guide a 30-ton block of coral through the air with the gentle push of a hand. While Ed worked in secret, teenagers who occasionally spied on him through the trees reported bizarre sights. They claimed they saw Ed standing over massive blocks of coral, singing to them and gently resting his hands on them. They reported seeing the massive stones floating through the air like hydrogen balloons. When Ed died, investigators entered his workshop. They did not find massive pulleys or heavy steel cables. Instead, they found strange tripods made of wooden telephone poles. They found mysterious boxes filled with copper wire wrapped into complex electromagnetic coils. They found heavy magnets and radio tuners. Ed was not a stonemason. He was an amateur electrical engineer. He was using a rudimentary homemade version of electromagnetism to alter the physical weight of the stone, acting as a modern-day wizard tapping into the Earth's grid. Coral Castle stands today as the ultimate undeniable physical proof that the laws of gravity and weight are not as absolute as our textbooks claim. If a single frail man in the 1920s could reverse engineer the magnetic secrets of the pyramids to float 30-ton blocks of coral, it forces us to completely reevaluate everything we saw at Baalbek, Puma Punku and Stonehenge. The global grid of energy is real. The ancient megalith builders knew exactly how to map it, how to tap into it, and how to use it to conquer gravity. But knowing how to build is only one part of the puzzle. To place these massive monuments with such mathematical precision across the entire globe, spanning oceans and continents, they needed to be able to see the entire globe. They needed an accurate map. And in our next chapter, we will unroll the ancient, impossible charts that prove our ancestors mapped the entire planet, including the frozen, hidden landmass of Antarctica, thousands of years before the invention of the compass or the satellite. To build the massive, interconnected grid of megalithic stone monuments we explored in the last chapter, our ancestors needed more than just an understanding of gravity and acoustics. They needed a deep, mathematical understanding of geography. You cannot align the Great Pyramid of Giza, the Nazca Lines, and the temples of Angkor Wat across thousands of miles of ocean and jungle by simply guessing. To build a global grid, you must first be able to see the globe. You need an accurate map. Mainstream history tells us that precise global mapping is a relatively modern invention, relying on satellites, advanced mathematics, and centuries of brave naval exploration. But hidden in the archives of history are impossible charts that prove someone had mapped the entire Earth and the stars above it long before we supposedly had the technology to do so. Our journey to uncover these time-defying maps begins in the year 1929 in Istanbul, Turkey. A group of historians was working in the ancient Topkapi Palace, sorting through dusty, forgotten archives, when they unrolled an old piece of gazelle skin parchment. It was a map, drawn in the year 1513 by an Ottoman admiral and cartographer named Piri Reis. At first glance, it looked like a beautifully detailed, standard naval chart from the Age of Discovery. But as geographers began to study the coastlines depicted on the gazelle skin, they realized this map contained information that was scientifically impossible for the 16th century. To understand the anomaly, we have to look at the basic science of navigation. To map a coastline accurately, you need to know your latitude, how far north or south you are, and your longitude, how far east or west you are. Latitude is relatively easy to figure out. You just measure the angle of the sun or the North Star above the horizon. But longitude is a massive mathematical nightmare. Because the Earth is constantly spinning, to know how far east or west you have traveled, you must know the exact time at your starting point compared to the exact time at your current location. Imagine driving in a featureless desert. If you know you are driving exactly 60 miles per hour and exactly 1 hour has passed, you know you have traveled 60 miles. But if you have no clock, you have absolutely no idea how far you have gone. For centuries, sailors had no reliable clocks that could survive the rocking waves and temperature changes of the ocean. It was not until the late 1700s, more than 250 years after the Piri Reis map was drawn, that a British carpenter named John Harrison invented the marine chronometer, finally solving the longitude problem. Yet, the Piri Reis map perfectly outlines the western coast of Africa and the eastern coast of South America with mathematically precise, modern longitudinal coordinates. It is as if the mapmaker had a highly accurate mechanical clock, or perhaps even an aerial view of the Atlantic Ocean, centuries before either existed. But the longitude problem is just the appetizer. The main course of this impossible mystery lies at the very bottom of the parchment. The Piri Reis map clearly shows a continuous coastline stretching southward from South America. It displays valleys, rivers, and mountain ranges. This landmass is unmistakably Antarctica. However, there is a massive, glaring problem with this. Antarctica was not officially discovered by modern explorers until the year 1820. How could a Turkish admiral in 1513 draw a continent that had not been discovered yet? In his own handwritten notes directly on the map, Piri Reis explains exactly how he did it. He openly states that he did not sail the world and chart these coasts himself. He was a compiler. He created his 1513 map by tracing and combining over 20 much older source maps, some of which he claimed dated back to the time of Alexander the Great, and perhaps even earlier. He was essentially copying the homework of a much older, lost civilization. This explanation becomes terrifyingly plausible when you look at the specific details of the Antarctic coastline he drew. The map does not show Antarctica as a solid block of white ice, which is how we see it today. It shows a rugged, ice-free coastline. It shows the actual bedrock, the hidden dirt and stone of the continent. Let us use a modern medical metaphor to understand the gravity of this. Looking at Antarctica today is like looking at a person wearing a massive, thick winter coat. You cannot see the shape of their body beneath the fabric. To see the actual topography of Antarctica, the mountains and valleys buried beneath miles of solid, ancient ice, you need the geographical equivalent of an X-ray machine. Modern science did not get that X-ray until the late 1950s. During an international scientific expedition, modern researchers dragged advanced seismic sounding equipment, essentially ground-penetrating radar and sonar, across the Antarctic ice sheet. By bouncing sound waves through the ice and timing how long they took to hit the bedrock and bounce back, they slowly created a profile of the hidden landmass beneath, specifically an area known as Queen Maud Land. In the 1960s, a professor named Charles Hapgood took the seismic profile of the subglacial Antarctic bedrock and compared it directly to the coastline drawn on the 1513 Piri Reis map. The match was absolutely stunning. The ancient map flawlessly depicted the hidden mountain ranges and coastal profiles of Queen Maud Land. Even the United States Air Force Cartography Division evaluated Hapgood's findings and officially admitted that the map displayed the subglacial topography of Antarctica with an accuracy that completely defied the known history of cartography. Geologists tell us that the last time the Queen Maud Land coast of Antarctica was free of ice was at least 6,000 to 12,000 years ago. This leaves us with a profound, inescapable conclusion. Someone with advanced geographical tools, an understanding of longitude, and the ability to map massive continents sailed the globe and charted Antarctica thousands of years before the first recorded human civilizations supposedly built their first mud brick cities. Piri Reis simply copied a surviving fragment of their lost global blueprint. But mapping the physical dirt of the Earth is only the beginning of their knowledge. If this ancient precursor civilization could look down and map the globe, did they also look up and map the cosmos? To find the answer, we leave the icy, hidden shores of Antarctica and travel to the blistering, dry landscape of West Africa, specifically the modern-day country of Mali. Here, isolated by harsh terrain, lives an indigenous group of people known as the Dogon tribe. For centuries, the Dogon lived a traditional, agrarian lifestyle, seemingly untouched by modern Western science or astronomy. But in the 1930s, two French anthropologists, Marcel Griol and Germain Dieterlen, spent years living with the Dogon priests, slowly earning their trust. When the priests finally revealed their most sacred, ancient oral traditions, the French scientists were left absolutely speechless. The core of the Dogon religion and origin story is based entirely on a star system located about 8.6 light-years away from Earth. Sirius. Sirius, often called the Dog Star, is the brightest star in the night sky. You can easily walk outside on a clear night and see it shining brightly with the naked eye. The Dogon knew all about this bright star, which they called Sigi Tolo. But they told the French anthropologists that Sigi Tolo was not alone. They claimed that it had a tiny, invisible companion star orbiting around it, which they called Po Tolo. The Dogon priests provided incredibly specific, scientifically precise details about this invisible companion. They stated that Po Tolo is made of a material that is heavier than anything found on Earth. They claimed that it is the smallest type of star, but paradoxically, it is incredibly massive in weight. They also drew diagrams in the sand showing that this invisible star moves in an elliptical, oval-shaped orbit around the main bright star, and they stated that it takes exactly 50 years to complete one full orbit. To a casual listener in the 1930s, this sounded like a quirky, imaginative myth. But to a modern astrophysicist, the Dogon priests were reciting a flawless, highly advanced textbook description of a white dwarf star. Let us break down the science of a white dwarf using a simple, everyday visual. Imagine taking a massive, raging bonfire and magically crushing it down until it is the size of a single, tiny, glowing coal. But somehow, it still weighs exactly the same as the entire bonfire. That is a white dwarf. It is the collapsed, dead core of a star. Because all that mass is squeezed into such a tiny space, the matter becomes incredibly dense. A single teaspoon of a white dwarf's material would weigh as much as a fully loaded dump truck here on Earth. The Dogon were absolutely correct. Sirius has a companion star. Today we call it Sirius B. It is a white dwarf, and its matter is unbelievably heavy, just as they described. Furthermore, because it is so small and sits so close to the blinding glare of the main star, Sirius A, it is completely invisible to the naked human eye. Modern science only suspected the existence of Sirius B in the mid-19th century by observing gravitational wobbles using powerful telescopes. It was not successfully photographed until the year 1970. Yet, an isolated tribe in West Africa had ancient wooden artifacts depicting the star system, and an oral tradition that perfectly described its invisible, super-dense nature and its precise 50-year elliptical orbit, long before any modern astronomer pointed a telescope at it. They also possessed accurate knowledge of the 4 major moons of Jupiter and the rings of Saturn, celestial bodies that cannot be seen without advanced optics. Skeptics argue that a passing European astronomer must have visited the tribe in the early 1900s and secretly taught them modern astrophysics just to play a prank on future anthropologists. But this theory completely ignores the physical evidence. The Dogon possessed centuries-old ceremonial masks and artifacts specifically designed to celebrate the 50-year orbital cycle of the invisible star. The Dogon people did not invent telescopes. According to their own legends, this astronomical knowledge was a gift passed down to them from ancient times, a remnant of a much older, highly advanced understanding of the universe. When you place the Piri Reis map next to the Dogon's knowledge of Sirius B, a terrifyingly clear picture of our past comes into focus. We are a species suffering from global amnesia. Our ancestors possessed a mastery of the physical world that allowed them to map the hidden bedrock of the Earth and chart the invisible, crushing gravity of collapsed stars. But if they knew so much about the mechanics of the heavens, did they also know what threats lingered in the dark space above them? In our next chapter, we will travel to the oldest known temple on Earth, an ancient structure that predates the pyramids by thousands of years, to decode a desperate, carved warning from the past, a message about a fiery apocalypse falling from the sky. If the Dogon tribe possessed an impossible map of the invisible stars, and Piri Reis copied an impossible map of the hidden Earth, we must ask, where did this profound knowledge come from? To find the source, we have to push our timeline so far back that the Great Pyramid of Giza looks like a modern skyscraper by comparison. We must travel to the end of the last ice age, to a dusty ridge in southeastern Turkey. Here lies an archaeological site that did not just rewrite the history books, it threw them completely into the fire. Welcome to Gobekli Tepe. Discovered in the mid-1990s by German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, Gobekli Tepe is officially recognized as the oldest temple in the world. When we radiocarbon date the organic material found buried around the stones, the results are staggering. The site dates back to roughly 9,600 BC, or nearly 12,000 years ago. To put that massive span of time into perspective, Gobekli Tepe was already ancient, abandoned, and buried under the dirt for 6,000 years before the very first stones of Stonehenge were even erected in England. But it is not just the age of Gobekli Tepe that shatters the mainstream narrative. It is the breathtaking complexity of its construction. The site consists of multiple circular enclosures made of massive, T-shaped limestone pillars. Some of these pillars are over 16 feet tall and weigh between 10 to 20 tons. They are perfectly carved, featuring smooth, flat surfaces and sharp 90-degree angles, and carved directly into the sides of these massive pillars, in high relief, meaning the stone around the animals was chipped away to make the figures pop out, are beautifully detailed images of scorpions, foxes, boars, vultures, and lions. According to standard academic history, 12,000 years ago, humanity consisted entirely of primitive hunter-gatherers. We are told they wore animal skins, lived in temporary camps, and had not yet invented agriculture, the wheel, or writing. Let us apply some basic, everyday logic to this scenario. Imagine taking a group of 50 people who spend their entire day chasing deer and picking wild berries just to survive. Now, tell them to stop hunting, go to a limestone quarry, cut out a 20-ton solid block of rock without metal tools, carry it up a steep hill, and carve a perfect 3D sculpture of a leaping fox into it. It is physically and logistically impossible. To build a megalithic complex like Gobekli Tepe, you need an organized workforce of hundreds, if not thousands, of people. And to keep those workers alive, you need a massive, stable food supply. You need organized agriculture. Gobekli Tepe proves that complex society, engineering, and monumental architecture existed thousands of years before the supposed invention of farming. It forces us to flip the script. Civilization did not slowly evolve from cavemen to city builders in a straight line. Gobekli Tepe is not the clumsy first attempt of a primitive people. It is the masterful, desperate final project of a highly advanced civilization trying to survive a dying world. To understand what they were trying to survive, we have to look closely at one specific pillar in the center of Enclosure D. It is known as Pillar 43, or the Vulture Stone. At first glance, Pillar 43 looks like a chaotic, ancient zoo. There is a prominent vulture holding a circular orb on its wing. Below it is a scorpion. Further down, there is a dog or a wolf, a snake, and at the very bottom, a chilling depiction of a headless man. For decades, archaeologists assumed this was just a hunting scene or a collection of primitive animal totems. But in 2017, a team of researchers led by Dr. Martin Sweatman at the University of Edinburgh took a completely different approach. They did not look at the animals as biological creatures. They looked at them as astronomical symbols. They looked at the vulture stone as a star map. To understand how this works, we need to understand a celestial mechanic called the precession of the equinoxes. Think of the Earth not just as a spinning ball, but as a slightly off-balance spinning top. As a top spins rapidly, its axis slowly wobbles in a wide circle. The Earth does the exact same thing, but its wobble is incredibly slow. It takes about 26,000 years for the Earth to complete one full wobble. Because our planet is slowly wobbling, the background constellations of stars appear to slowly shift their positions in the night sky over thousands of years. Because we know the exact mathematical rate of this planetary wobble, modern astronomers can use software to rewind the night sky. We can type in any date from history, and the computer will show us exactly where the stars were positioned on that specific night. When the researchers from the University of Edinburgh analyzed Pillar 43, they realized that the animals perfectly matched the ancient zodiac constellations. The scorpion is an exact match for the constellation Scorpius. The vulture or eagle represents the constellation Sagittarius. The wolf represents the constellation Lupus. The circular orb resting on the vulture's wing represents the sun. The ancient builders of Gobekli Tepe carved a specific arrangement of constellations with the sun sitting in a very precise location. They used the stars as a massive cosmic clock to create a timestamp. When the researchers ran their astronomical software backward to find the exact date when the real night sky matched the carving on Pillar 43, the computer stopped at a terrifyingly specific window of time, approximately 10,950 BC. Why would the builders of this massive megalithic site go through the agonizing effort of carving a 20-ton stone just to record that specific date? Because 10,950 BC marks the exact beginning of one of the most catastrophic, violent events in the geological history of the Earth. It marks the day the sky fell. At the bottom of Pillar 43, remember the carving of the headless man? It is a universal, gruesome symbol for mass death and human extinction. The Edinburgh researchers concluded that the vulture stone is not just a calendar, it is a memorial. It is a desperate, carved warning about a devastating cosmic impact. Around 10,950 BC, the Earth's orbit crossed paths with the torrid meteor stream. a massive, dense cloud of debris left behind by a giant, disintegrating comet. Imagine the Earth driving a car straight into a cosmic minefield. As our planet plowed through this debris field, massive fragments of the comet entered our atmosphere. They did not just create a pretty meteor shower. These were mountains of ice and rock traveling at tens of thousands of miles per hour. When they hit the atmosphere, the friction caused them to superheat and explode in mid-air, exactly like the airburst weapons we discussed in the Libyan desert, but on a global scale. The heat from these multiple simultaneous comet explosions was unimaginable. They struck the vast ice sheets covering North America and Europe. The flash melting of millions of cubic miles of solid ice sent massive, unimaginable pulses of freezing fresh water rushing into the global oceans. It plunged the entire planet into a brutal, 1,000-year freeze, known to geologists as the Younger Dryas period. The vulture stone at Gobekli Tepe is the smoking gun. It is the physical, geological timestamp of the apocalypse. The survivors of this global cataclysm, the remnants of the advanced civilization that possessed the flight of the Vimanas, the engineering of Puma Punku, and the astronomical knowledge of the Dogon, gathered in southern Turkey. They used their surviving knowledge of acoustics, megalithic engineering, and astronomy to build Gobekli Tepe. They did not build it as a place to live. They built it as a permanent, unbreakable message in a bottle for future generations. We were here. We mapped the stars. We mapped the earth. And then the fire came from the sky and wiped us out. And then they did something even more inexplicable. After going through the monumental effort of building this massive stone complex, they deliberately buried it. They carried millions of baskets of dirt and completely covered Gobekli Tepe, hiding it perfectly beneath an artificial hill. Why? Because they knew that an exposed message would weather, erode, and eventually be destroyed by the very nature it was warning against. By burying it, they essentially sealed it in a massive time capsule, perfectly preserving the 3D carvings in the dark vacuum of the dirt, waiting 12,000 years for humanity to become technologically advanced enough to dig it up and understand the warning. The warning of the vulture stone is clear. The fire from above triggers the water from below. The comet strikes melted the ice, and the oceans rose with terrifying speed, wiping the global map clean. In our final chapter, we will follow that rising water. We will dive beneath the waves to explore the drowned, silent cities that serve as the final resting place for this lost epoch of humanity. And we will finally understand the terrifying reality of the Great Reset. At the end of the last chapter, we decoded the terrifying message left on the vulture stone at Gobekli Tepe. It described a massive global cataclysm around 10,950 BC, a period when fragmented comets from the torrid meteor stream slammed into the Earth. But the immediate fire and explosive heat of the impacts were only the first phase of the apocalypse. The true destruction, the force that completely erased this advanced global civilization from the map, came in the devastating aftermath. When those superheated comets struck the massive 2-mile-thick ice sheets covering North America and Northern Europe, they triggered a flash-melting event of unimaginable proportions. Trillions of gallons of freezing freshwater poured into the world's oceans in a geological blink of an eye. Geologists refer to this sudden, violent surge as Meltwater Pulse 1b. The sea levels did not just creep up a few inches. They surged by nearly 400 feet, or about 120 meters. To understand the sheer civilization-ending gravity of a 400-foot sea level rise, we just need to look at our own modern world. Where do we build our most advanced, populous, and economically vital cities? We build them on the coast. New York, Tokyo, London, Sydney, Los Angeles. They all sit right on the edge of the water to utilize global shipping and trade routes. If the oceans were to suddenly rise by 400 feet today, every single one of our greatest architectural and technological achievements would vanish beneath the dark waves. Thousands of years from now, a future civilization might find a few surviving mountain cabins and assume we were a primitive species of forest dwellers, completely unaware of the drowned skyscrapers off the coast. The exact same fate befell the ancient megalithic builders. To find the true hubs of their lost global network, we cannot just look at the dry land. We have to put on scuba gear and dive into the crushing pressure of the deep. Our first dive takes us to the far western edge of the Pacific Ocean, near the tiny Japanese island of Yonaguni, located just off the coast of Taiwan. In 1986, a local dive instructor named Kihachiro Aratake was exploring the uncharted waters off the island, looking for hammerhead sharks to show his tourists. As he swam deeper into the strong underwater currents, a massive, shadowy shape began to emerge from the gloom. It was not a coral reef. It was a staggering megalithic monument. Aratake had stumbled upon a massive stone complex sitting roughly 80 feet below the surface. Known today as the Yonaguni Monument, the structure is roughly 165 feet long and 65 feet wide. At first glance, it looks exactly like a ziggurat or a massive stepped pyramid carved directly out of the living bedrock. It features huge, perfectly flat terraces, massive descending staircases, and sheer drop-offs. The mainstream academic establishment immediately pushed back against the idea that this was a man-made structure. Geologists, most notably Dr. Robert Schoch, argued that Yonaguni is simply a natural geological formation. The local bedrock is composed of sandstone and mudstone, which has a tendency to fracture along natural tectonic fault lines. They claim that ocean currents and seismic activity over millions of years simply broke the rock into straight lines, creating the illusion of stairs and walls. Let us test that mainstream theory using basic, everyday logic. Yes, it is an undeniable fact of geology that certain rocks shear in straight lines, but we must look at the overall symmetry and specific features of the monument. Imagine dropping a large pane of window glass onto a concrete floor. The glass will shatter into straight lines and sharp angles, but it will absolutely never accidentally shatter into the perfect shape of a miniature glass staircase. Nature does not build complex, multi-level architectural geometry. Yet, at Yonaguni, we see a massive 90-degree inner corner that looks exactly like a modern street intersection. We see a perfectly straight, wide trench running along the base of the monument, which looks exactly like a planned drainage canal or a protective moat. There is a section featuring two massive, perfectly parallel stone pillars standing closely together, known as the twin megaliths. Most damning of all, there is a large star-shaped hole drilled into the flat rock platform, and a separate stone carving that bears a striking resemblance to a human face or an Easter Island moai statue. Dr. Masaki Kimura, a marine geologist from the University of the Ryukyus, has spent over 15 years mapping every inch of the Yonaguni monument. He firmly concluded that while the base rock is natural, it was extensively terraformed and carved by human hands. It is the underwater equivalent of the intricately carved, mortarless walls we saw at Sacsayhuaman, or the precision cuts of Puma Punku. But Yonaguni is currently 80 feet underwater. The last time this massive stone stage was sitting high and dry above the sea level was over 10,000 years ago, lining up perfectly with the Ice Age meltwater pulse. Yonaguni was likely a coastal temple or a terraced ceremonial center that was abruptly swallowed by the rising Pacific. If Yonaguni gives us an impossible underwater temple, our next destination gives us an entire impossible underwater metropolis. We are leaving the Pacific Ocean and traveling thousands of miles west to the Arabian Sea, just off the western coast of India, near the modern state of Gujarat. In our earlier chapters, we discussed the ancient Indian epics, specifically the Mahabharata, which described flying Vimanas and the devastating fallout of nuclear-style weaponry. Another major story in these ancient texts focuses on Lord Krishna, a highly revered deity. The texts clearly state that Krishna ruled over a massive, glittering, technologically advanced city of gold called Dwarka. But the story ends in tragedy. The texts say that after Krishna departed the earth, the oceans violently rose up and completely swallowed the magnificent city of Dwarka in a single day, hiding it forever beneath the waves. For centuries, Western historians and archaeologists dismissed the story of Dwarka as a beautiful fairy tale, a religious myth with no grounding in physical reality. But the ocean does not care about academic opinions. It only cares about preserving the truth in the dark. Between 1999 and 2001, India's National Institute of Ocean Technology was conducting routine acoustic pollution surveys in the Gulf of Khambat. They were dragging advanced side-scan sonar equipment behind their boats, bouncing sound waves off the ocean floor to map the terrain. When the scientists looked at the sonar readouts, their jaws dropped. Sitting 120 feet below the surface of the churning ocean, the sonar did not show random rocks or natural fault lines. It showed a massive, mathematically perfect grid. The acoustic images revealed the undeniable foundations of a sprawling city, stretching for over 5 miles long and 2 miles wide. When marine archaeologists eventually sent divers and dredging equipment down into the murky, dangerous waters, they confirmed the sonar's impossible findings. They found massive sandstone walls, paved streets laid out in a rigid grid pattern, and the heavy foundations of large buildings. They hauled up thousands of artifacts, including pottery shards, beads, semi-precious stones, and human bones. They also found massive stone anchors. These were huge, heavy, triangular blocks of stone with perfectly round holes drilled through the top for a thick rope. These anchors proved that the people of this sunken city were operating massive, ocean-going ships. They were a global maritime power. But the most paradigm-shattering moment came when the scientists dredged up a piece of carved wood from the underwater ruins and sent it to a laboratory for radiocarbon dating. Mainstream history insists that the very first signs of urban civilization in India, the Indus Valley Civilization, did not begin until roughly 2500 BC. The piece of wood from the sunken city of Dwarka was carbon dated to 7500 BC, making the city at least 9,500 years old. Let the magnitude of that sink in. A massive, geometrically planned city, 5 miles long, operating a fleet of massive ships, existed thousands of years before the first bricks were supposedly laid in Mesopotamia or Egypt. And just like the ancient texts described, it was violently swallowed by the sea. The 120-foot depth of the ruins aligns flawlessly with the sudden sea level rise of the Younger Dryas meltwater pulse. The perfectly square blocks of Yonaguni and the sprawling grid-like streets of Sunken Dwarka are not isolated anomalies. They are the physical, irrefutable ghosts of the old world. They prove that the global stories of a great, world-destroying flood, stories found in almost every ancient culture, from the biblical Noah's Ark to the Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh to Plato's tragic tale of Atlantis, are not just campfire stories. They are deeply traumatized ancestral memories of a very real, very violent geological cataclysm. The advanced civilization that flew the Vimanas, drilled the granite in Egypt, mapped the invisible stars, and tapped into the Earth's magnetic grid was completely washed away. The straight, upward line of history was broken, and humanity was violently forced back into the caves to start the brutal climb all over again. But as we pull these pieces together, what is the final, overarching lesson of this forbidden history? In our next, final chapter, we will connect all the dots we have gathered on this massive journey. We will explore the theory of the Great Reset, understand why mainstream academia is so terrified to accept this lost timeline, and ask the most important question of all. If history is a cycle, are we currently marching blindly toward our own reset? We have explored the impossible megaliths of South America, the decoded flight manuals of India, the cosmic warning carved in stone at Gobekli Tepe, and the drowned cities resting silently on the ocean floor. When you lay all of these physical anomalies out on a table, they do not look like random, isolated mysteries. They look like the scattered debris of a massive, global accident. To connect these final pieces, we have to stop looking at history as a straight, unbroken line of progress. We must look at the scientific reality of the Earth's violent climate history. We have to face the terrifying truth of the Great Reset. To understand what hit the reset button on human civilization, we have to look at the exact time frame we keep circling back to, the period between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago. In the field of geology and paleoclimatology, this specific window of time is known as the Younger Dryas. Let us use a simple, everyday metaphor to understand the Younger Dryas. Imagine you are driving a car on a freezing winter day with the heater completely broken. Slowly, over a long time, the car starts to naturally warm up because the sun is coming out. You take off your heavy winter coat. But suddenly, without warning, the windows shatter, a blizzard blows directly into the car, and the temperature instantly drops back to sub-zero. You freeze for an hour. Then, just as suddenly, someone pours boiling water over the car, melting the snow in seconds. That is exactly what happened to the Earth. Around 12,800 years ago, the planet was slowly warming up, pulling itself out of the long ice age. But then, the climate violently snapped back into deeper, brutal glacial conditions. This freezing period lasted for roughly 1,200 years. Then, around 11,600 years ago, The temperature shot back up with terrifying, unprecedented speed. How do we know this? We do not have to guess. Scientists have drilled massive, hollow tubes deep into the ancient ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica, pulling up solid cylinders of ice called ice cores. Ice cores work exactly like the rings of a tree. Every year, a new layer of snow falls and compresses, trapping microscopic bubbles of ancient atmosphere. By analyzing these trapped air bubbles, scientists can read the exact temperature of the Earth year by year, going back hundreds of thousands of years. The ice cores show that the sudden temperature drop and the even more sudden warming that ended the Younger Dryas did not happen over thousands of years. They happened in the span of a single human lifetime. Perhaps even in just a few years. What could cause such a violent, immediate disruption to the entire planetary climate? The answer is buried in the dirt just below our feet. All across North America, Europe, and parts of the Middle East, geologists have discovered a very distinct dark layer of soil buried deep underground, dating exactly to 12,800 years ago. It is called the Black Mat. Below this black mat, we find the bones of massive Ice Age animals, woolly mammoths, saber-toothed cats, and giant ground sloths. Above this black mat layer, those animals completely disappear. They went extinct instantly. When forensic geologists placed samples of this black mat under powerful electron microscopes, they found a chilling cocktail of materials. They found high concentrations of iridium, platinum, and magnetic spherules. Most importantly, they found millions of microscopic nanodiamonds. Let us be very clear about how nanodiamonds are formed. You cannot make them with a forest fire. You cannot make them with a volcano. To create these microscopic diamonds, you need an event that generates unimaginable shockwave pressure and heat, temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit in a fraction of a second. On Earth, there are only two ways to create a layer of nanodiamonds spanning 50 million square kilometers. You either detonate thousands of modern nuclear weapons simultaneously, or you are hit by a massive, fragmented comet. This is the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. It perfectly matches the fiery warning we saw carved into the vulture stone at Gobekli Tepe. A fragmented comet from the torrid meteor stream slammed into the Earth. The impacts set the world on fire, throwing so much smoke and ash into the atmosphere that it blocked out the sun, triggering a sudden, brutal freezing period. But it is the end of this freezing period, the sudden warming event 11,600 years ago, that delivered the final fatal blow to the advanced ancient civilization. When the climate violently snapped back to warm temperatures, the massive 2-mile-thick ice sheets covering North America and Europe melted at a catastrophic rate. This caused a phenomenon known as Meltwater Pulse 1b. Millions of cubic miles of freezing water rushed into the world's oceans. The global sea level surged upward by roughly 400 feet. Imagine taking a shallow baking pan filled with water, building tiny sand castles along the edges, and then suddenly dumping a heavy bucket of water directly into the center of the pan. The resulting tidal waves and rising water would instantly obliterate the sand castles. That is exactly what happened to the ancient, globe-spanning maritime civilization. Their ports, their coastal energy grids, their magnificent cities like Dwarka and Yonaguni, they were all swallowed by the rising tide in a matter of weeks, if not days. This catastrophic, civilization-ending flood is not just recorded in geological ice cores and sonar scans. It is recorded in the most famous, heavily debated story in human history, the story of Atlantis. For centuries, mainstream academics have dismissed Plato's account of Atlantis as a philosophical fairy tale, an allegory about a utopian society that became arrogant and was punished by the gods. But if we strip away the philosophy and look at the hard, mathematical timeline Plato provides, the correlation is absolutely terrifying. Plato wrote his dialogues about Atlantis around 360 BC. But he did not invent the story. He clearly states that the story was passed down to his ancestor, a Greek lawmaker named Solon. According to the text, Solon traveled to Egypt around 600 BC and visited the ancient temple of Sais. There, the high priests of Egypt, who were the keepers of the oldest historical records in the ancient world, told Solon about a magnificent, highly advanced seafaring civilization that was destroyed by earthquakes and a massive flood. The Egyptian priests gave Solon a very specific time frame. They told him that the destruction of Atlantis happened exactly 9,000 years before Solon's visit. Let us do the basic math. Solon was in Egypt in 600 BC. Add the 9,000 years the priests mentioned. That gives us a date of 9,600 BC. In our modern calendar, 9,600 BC is exactly 11,600 years ago. 11,600 years ago is the exact scientifically verified date that the Greenland ice cores tell us the Younger Dryas ended. It is the exact date of Meltwater Pulse 1b, when the oceans violently rose 400 feet. Plato's timeline is not a fairy tale. It is a precise, historical, geological timestamp. Atlantis was not just a single, magical island. It was the collective memory of a highly advanced global coastal civilization that was completely drowned during the Great Reset. But not everyone died. When the coastal cities sank, the terrified survivors, the scientists, the engineers, the astronomers, fled inland to the highest ground they could find. They fled to the high Andes of South America, the highlands of Mexico, the mountains of Turkey, and the remote plateaus of Egypt. This explains the greatest mystery of standard archaeology. Mainstream history tells us that civilization slowly evolved. But when we look at the Sumerians in Mesopotamia or the early dynastic Egyptians, they do not show a slow evolution. They appear out of nowhere, already possessing advanced agriculture, complex mathematics, written language, and an obsession with mapping the stars. They did not invent these things from scratch. They inherited them. All over the world, disconnected indigenous cultures share the exact same origin story. In South America, the legends speak of Viracocha, a tall, bearded man who arrived on a boat after a massive flood, carrying a mysterious bag, teaching the surviving natives how to build with megalithic stone and how to farm. In Mexico, they called him Quetzalcoatl. In Sumeria, they called him Oan. In Egypt, they spoke of Thoth. These were not magical gods. They were traumatized refugees. They were the surviving engineers of the sunken world, desperately trying to perform a planetary reboot. They traveled the globe, handing out fragments of their lost science. A little bit of agriculture here, a little bit of astronomy there, like a person trying to rebuild a shattered supercomputer using only a few salvaged microchips. They gathered the primitive hunter-gatherers, organized them, and tried to restart civilization. They built massive time capsules like Gobekli Tepe to warn us, and they aligned the Great Pyramid to the stars to remind us of the celestial mechanics that dictate our fate. The Great Reset is not a myth. It is the undeniable physical reality of our planet. We are a species with amnesia, wandering through the ruins of a forgotten golden age, desperately trying to remember who we really are. We have traveled thousands of miles across the globe and thousands of years back in time. We have stood in the shadows of the massive, 1,000-ton foundation blocks of Baalbek and ran our fingers along the laser-straight, diamond-hard cuts of Puma Punku. We have looked at the undeniable reality of ancient mechanical computers in Greece and chemical batteries in the deserts of Iraq. We opened the ancient flight manuals of India that described roaring jet engines, and we saw the terrifying, vitrified scars of radioactive heat left behind at Mohenjo-Daro. We felt the acoustic resonance of underground chambers designed to alter human consciousness, and we unrolled impossible maps that charted the hidden bedrock of Antarctica centuries before the invention of modern sonar. Finally, we read the desperate carved warning of a fiery apocalypse at Gobekli Tepe, and we dove into the dark, churning waters to see the drowned, grid-like streets of the civilization that did not survive the Great Reset. When you take all of these physical anomalies, all of these geological timestamps, and place them side by side, the standard textbook version of our past completely collapses. The comforting story that human progress is a straight, unbroken line, starting with cavemen and ending with us, is an illusion. History is not a straight line. It is a wheel. It is a continuous, brutal cycle of brilliant peaks and catastrophic valleys. Think of human civilization like a massive, towering forest. A forest can grow for thousands of years, creating a complex, thriving ecosystem that reaches incredible heights. But then, a devastating wildfire sweeps through, burning everything to ash. To a person born the day after the fire, the world is just dirt, ashes, and a few tiny green shoots. Because they have never seen the towering trees, they look at their small green shoots and proudly believe they are the very first things to ever grow. They do not realize they are standing on the ashes of giants. That is exactly what we are. We are a species suffering from profound collective amnesia. The things we proudly call our greatest modern inventions, aviation, advanced machining, electrical grids, and global navigation, might not be new inventions at all. They are rediscoveries. We are simply remembering the science that was violently erased from our collective memory over 11,000 years ago during the cataclysms of the Younger Dryas. Our ancestors were not primitive brutes who got lucky with copper chisels and hemp ropes. They were master engineers, brilliant astrophysicists, and planetary architects who understood the deep, invisible forces of acoustics, electromagnetism, and gravity in ways we are only just beginning to comprehend today. This realization should not frighten us. It should empower us. It challenges us to look at the world with a new sense of profound wonder and critical thinking. The next time you see a documentary about an ancient ruin, or read an article about a newly discovered artifact, do not just blindly accept the neat, packaged explanation. Look at the tool marks. Question the logistics of the weight. Ask yourself how it was done. The truth is written in the stone, waiting patiently for anyone brave enough to actually read it. We have only just scratched the surface of our forgotten past. There are countless more anomalies buried in the dirt, hidden in the jungles, and resting at the bottom of the oceans, waiting to be found. Thank you for taking this massive, incredible journey with me to uncover the forbidden history of our planet. If this exploration shifted your perspective, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you do not miss our next deep dive into the unknown. Leave a comment below and tell me, which of the ancient mysteries we discussed today blew your mind the most? Was it the ancient flying machines, the maps of Antarctica, or the sunken cities? Until next time, keep questioning everything and never stop digging for the truth.